All right. Thanks very much, Michael, for having me participate in this, and everybody for being here. I'm from the University of Exeter. In my normal set of activities, I work on advising on climate policy with governments, often the European Commission, a little bit the UK government, sorry, yeah. And I run one of these, with our team, we run one of these large multi-sectoral models of the economy plus technology plus climate to do that task of informing climate policy. But this project is not exactly about this. It's about a peripheral idea which is really important, which is stranded assets. And more crucially, I think, if you talk about stranded assets, you're talking about time. So we want to look at what the role of time is. In fact, it's interesting to think that in economics, time doesn't appear very often in the discussion. Time, what does it mean? It means the time over which whatever people invest in, the time that is needed in order to have return, simply. And somehow in economics, especially in macroeconomics, it always seems to disappear, and it's related to the fact that we expect there to be an equilibrium. So this project is done with Lancaster. Andy Jarvis is at the back, and he's going to come in discussion, I think. Okay, so the economy thrives on change, but also sometimes can't handle it. I'll start with this chart from the Bank of England. Now, Tim's introduced this pretty well, so I can move a bit quicker over this. The Bank of England has made this helpful distinction between transition risks and physical risks of climate change. Now, physical risks are the risks that climate change can devalue some assets through perhaps storms, extreme events, floods, and so on, while transition risks are the risks we face as we rapidly transform the economy. Now, it's not to say that the Bank of England recommends some midway path. It's not the case at all. It's just to be aware of what risks are involved in the transformation. I've been closely sort of watching the development of the IPCC process in recent months, let's say, up to the report on 1.5 degree. And it's been quite interesting to see how that's been discussed. The IPCC has been proposing these, or putting forward these various ways one could achieve the 1.5 targets according to the carbon budget and knowledge from the physical sciences. And there's various ways that this could be achieved, some of which involve some amounts of negative emissions, some that don't. And obviously, if you have no negative emissions, you need to act faster earlier on. That's roughly the simplest sort of insight you get from that. But the rate of transformation, as Tim's been emphasizing, is staggering. It's very rapid, much more rapid than the rate at which we get income from the assets we invest in. So what does that mean really for the economy? It means a rapid transformation, and the question is whether the economy can take that rapid change. Can the economy go around the bend, really? Or what happens if it doesn't go around the bend? Exactly what happens is, I don't think anybody knows really. But one thing we do know, if we look back into economic history a little bit, we know the structure of technological change, the diffusion of great waves of innovation, and we know that there's periods of rapid rise, rapid change, and rise of income. There's also periods of instability in between each of these waves of clusters of technology. And we know that it potentially is in one of those transitions between one wave to another, with artificial intelligence coming in, and that is driving lots of change in the economy. But also the low-carbon transition is an important one, where a similar type of instability could be developing, and that's, I think, exactly what the Bank of England is going on about. Now the question is, are we... Okay, I should before that, I should just note, this is straight from Michael's book, that if you look at where investment is sectorally currently for R&D in the economy, it goes in the exact reverse order as where you have in the order of the technologies in the various waves of innovation that we've seen historically. It makes sense that you think a lot of investment will be in pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and I should also say artificial intelligence. While IT comes second, and then other technology, heavier industry comes, and then back there you've got what is pretty old technology now, where there's not much R&D happening, not much development, and that follows from that these things are pretty old. I think the structure of the economy is somewhat like that. So this is where we're putting the investment at the moment. Okay, so the question is, are we in a low carbon transition now? So that's a debate we can have for a long time, and I mean, I think my team has been arguing that we potentially are, but it's hard to prove. Anyway, there's plenty of effect from the cumulative impact of past policies that is driving currently the system towards technological change. You've got indications from, for example, the International Energy Agency looking at the rise of renewables. It's still small, but it is rising, and that's slowly chipping away at our consumption of fossil fuels. And here's the same, the IEA again, Global EV Outlook, looking at the rise of electric vehicles, electric mobility in various countries, and it is rising. And that chipping away at fossil fuels, of course, is causing potential if the tendency carries on, potential overcapacity in the fossil fuel sector. That could mean stranded assets. Of course, stranded assets is a broader question than just this. Okay, so we've spent time studying this question. What do we mean by stranded assets? So in the specific case of fossil fuels, and of course stranded assets in the economy is a much broader question than just that. Okay, but you can think of all the barrels of oil that are in the ground, all the tons of coal that are in the ground that could be valued in financial markets and end up never being consumed. Right? That has enormous value. People might have invested in that, and that could be stranded, loses value at the moment where we realize that we haven't got the demand to actually sell these things. So if the demand turns out lower than what the expectations were, we could have this that's stranded. Of course, it would be easy if we could extract these barrels one at a time and sell them and check whether we've got the demand, but that is never what happens. What happens is that in order to extract this, we've got to build these kinds of things. And these kinds of things live for a long time. And there's an expectation of selling enough product in order to first repay whatever finance came in to allow us to build these things, and then make a profit afterwards. Now, if we transition too rapidly, perhaps we transition just at the payback time, then we just have no return. And if we transition more rapidly than the payback time, of course we're making a financial loss, and that is what we're talking about. So you think of the present day where the bets are set, and then we wait to see whether we win or whether we lose, when we have such long-lived capital. Okay, so to put it simply, you imagine people have an expected scenario of the future for supply and price, and then something else might happen instead, and then if you wanted to calculate the loss, you'd take the two, multiplied and sum, you could have an idea what could be the value of the stranded assets. We did this, and we come up with pretty large numbers, which are, depending whether you look at the current trend of technology or what is needed to reach the climate target, and you come to values that are important enough that they're comparable to the seed of the financial crisis in 2008, so it's 1 to 5 trillion, and that's discounted with a pretty high discount rate. That's just for presentational purposes, but they are large numbers. And that's just oil and gas. Of course, What gets stranded in the economy is much broader because you've got factories of all sorts of things, car factories, for example, or factories that make parts that are used downstream for making other things that are eventually related to fossil fuels. And actually, it's possible that a whole load of capital needs to be scrapped in a rapid transition. Okay, so this paper had some impact. It seems people care quite a bit about this. It went into a lot of newspapers. This was Al Gore actually retweeting this, and it was in the Guardian, and also other newspapers, which interestingly did comment on this quite accurately. So it seems people think this is a big question, and obviously we should be looking at that. And I think it's still at its infancy, especially if I recall talking to people at the Bank of England where they are looking for literature on this. Okay, so what explains rates of structural change in an adaptive economy, and what's a rate that's too fast? Okay, so this, Andy gave me this picture I quite like, so what happens if you go around the bend too fast? Okay, so what explains the rate of growth of the economy? So there are a few stylized features of the economy. Economic growth happens at around 3% per year. Simple. Okay, some places might go faster, some places might go slower. If you take that rate of growth and see at which rate of return you need to have, you have a lifetime of capital that's roughly 30 years long. The rate of return on capital is itself 3% per year as well. So while this return profile is varied between different types of assets, that's sort of what you see globally. So the capital turnover follows a time scale of roughly 30-40 years, and that's also roughly related to the working lifetime of a person. So it all sort of makes sense, right? So intuitively we know that's sort of true. But capital has distributed lifetimes at all time scales. This is what I'm going to show, and that's what really matters, right? It's not as if all capital had a life of 30 years. In fact, you think of buildings, you think of all sorts of things we use, it's not like that. Okay, so here's old work from Arnold Grubler at YASA, where he looked at the diffusion rates of a whole load of types of goods and services, goods and capital equipment that we use in the economy. Of course, the diffusion rate is related to the lifetime, and we have a pretty broad and long-tailed distribution. So that's one indication that the distribution of capital lifetimes is very broad. Here's a piece of work from Andy, where he's looking at the lifetime of various components of a building. And there you can see some things are very short-lived. It's almost like operational expenses, while some things are very long-lived. You could think of the structure, the steel involved in this. So why am I showing this? It's because, okay, but just note that this is a log scale, so that's a log normal distribution, right? Roughly speaking. Why am I showing this? It's because if we're rapidly transitioning and we need to, say, transform everything that's in that building to make it low carbon, you've got a lot of stuff that's in the long-lived range. If you think of the whole economy like this, it's the same thing. You've got, do you need to, what happens if you need to scrap all of that's long-lived here? And what happens to return on investment in the whole economy? Okay, so here the house itself has a mean of about 50 years, right? A car may be 15 years. You can imagine all the different things we use. Some things will survive just for a lifetime that's short enough that you can easily keep it till the end of its lifetime and still do the rapid transition. But there are other types of equipment where that's not going to be the case. Well, it's sort of surprising to realize that we don't really know this. In fact, there isn't data about this. So we propose to gather this sort of data. Okay, so the TIDE project is what we proposed to the rebuilding macro. So effectively it's quite simple, really. It's to gather a whole big load of data through what's called process-based lifecycle analysis, where we would have a lot of information about this sort of thing. And we could actually have that distribution of the lifetime of assets in the whole economy. That sounds very ambitious, but I think it's possible to focus on some elements that really make it representative of what we've got. And then from that, we'd be able to see what the losses would be during a rapid transition. So first we do a big literature review, data mining and so on, in order to build this, and in order to know the value in the lifetime, and then we can use this in any of the integrated assessment models, including our large multi-sectoral model, to see what that means for the real economy as we transition if we put these losses in. Of course, there's a question of, is the economy able to produce enough finance to replace all of that capital? And there's a question of what happens if we lose all of the expected profit on these assets that we're not getting anymore, right? So I think there's the duality of these two questions that's involved. And crucially, I think, is understanding who the winners and losers are in that process, and whether that generates more inequality, or whether that generates important geopolitics, and so on. Ultimately, who owns all this? You'll be aware that a lot of this is owned by, ultimately, pension funds. Here, last night, Andy just sent me that picture. That's the USS pension scheme, under which some of us contribute, and that's important. So here, you see what's at the top. It's not, I think it's not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing ethically. It probably is, but the point to make there is that these sorts of assets have a risk-return profile that is sought after by these types of investment funds. Why? Because it has a function. The function is to provide a pension to all of these people. Now, as we change this, the type of assets we've got in the economy, in a low-carbon transition, the risk-return profile of a lot of assets change. We're not too clear exactly what that means when that's changed. Okay, so just to finish, there's a lot of talk about divestment as a solution to the fossil fuel domination of the financial sector. I've been talking to people in the financial sector and people at the Bank of England, and one thing that they say is divestment is a bit of a red herring, because if, say, the Church of England divests from all of its fossil fuel assets, some other guy elsewhere in the world would probably buy it. It's only when you have no demand for fossil fuels that really these assets disappear entirely. They don't disappear otherwise. Yeah, they become traded as junk. Now, financial disclosure helps, obviously, because information transfer is better, right? But it's still the case that you need to reduce the demand for fossil fuels to zero until these assets entirely disappear. So, but what is the policy remedy for stranded assets? I think that's the bigger question, and I don't think people really know what the answer is, but I think we need to understand better the dynamics of change in the financial sector and the timescales that are involved in order to comment on this. So we need to understand really the structure of capital and how quickly it can change. The high carbon versus the low carbon economy, are they the same really? And understand who the losers are. Thank you.